If the beginnings of British cinema are defined by fragmentation, by activity without system, production without control, then the next phase reveals something that might, at first glance, look like a solution. Because there is success. There are films that draw audiences, films that are widely seen, films that generate recognition, and, for a time, something that resembles momentum. But that success does not take the form of a stable industry. It takes the form of a cycle. At the centre of that cycle is Gainsborough Pictures. And what Gainsborough produces is not a system, not a fully integrated structure, but something more immediate: popular cinema. The melodramas associated with Gainsborough, emotionally heightened, narratively driven, often centred on themes of desire, conflict, and social constraint, connect with audiences in a way that earlier British films had struggled to do consistently. They are not tentative, they are direct. They understand their appeal and they deliver it. This is the first moment in this history where British cinema demonstrates something important. It can attract and hold an audience at scale. And that matters because one of the underlying problems in the earlier phase is not just structural but perceptual. Can British cinema compete for attention within its own market? Gainsborough answers that question, at least temporarily, with a clear yes. But the form that answer takes is significant because it is not built on coordination, it is built on repetition. The Gainsborough melodramas form a recognisable pattern, a set of expectations that audiences come to understand. Themes recur, structures repeat, emotional registers are heightened in familiar ways. And this repetition is not a weakness, it is the mechanism of success. Audiences return not because each film is entirely new, but because it is recognisably part of something they already understand. To see how this works in practice, you have to look at the films themselves. One of the defining titles is The Man in Grey. Set in the 18th century, it tells a story of ambition, betrayal, and social climbing, built around a central conflict between characters whose desires cannot be reconciled within the rigid structures of class and expectation. The film is not subtle. It is designed to be felt. Characters are drawn in strong, clear lines. Emotions are heightened. Moral tensions are pushed to the surface. And audiences respond. The success of The Man in Grey is immediate and significant. It becomes one of the most popular British films of its time, drawing large audiences and establishing a model that will be repeated. That model continues with films like Fanny by Gaslight. Again, the setting is historical. Again, the narrative is driven by desire, constraint, and emotional conflict. Again, the presentation is direct, accessible, and unapologetically dramatic. And again, audiences respond. These films are not isolated successes, they are part of a cycle, a sequence of productions that build on each other, reinforcing a set of expectations that audiences come to recognise and anticipate. Stars become associated with the form. Actors such as Margaret Lockwood and James Mason emerge as central figures within this cycle, their screen personas closely tied to the emotional intensity and moral ambiguity of the films themselves. Lockwood in particular becomes emblematic of the Gainsborough style, often playing characters who are complex, driven, and not easily contained within conventional moral frameworks. Mason similarly brings a presence that combines charm with a sense of danger, reinforcing the heightened emotional world these films inhabit. What this creates is not just a series of films, but a recognizable experience. Audiences know what they are getting, and crucially, they want it. This is the closest British cinema has come up to this point to a working model, but it is a model based on content, not structure. That distinction is critical because while Gainsborough can produce successful films, it does not control the conditions under which those films exist. To understand that limitation, you have to look beyond the films. Gainsborough is part of a broader production environment, connected to larger companies such as the Rank organization. There are attempts here to create a more integrated system to connect production with distribution and exhibition, but this integration is incomplete. It does not fully resolve the fragmentation that has defined British cinema from the beginning. Films can be produced successfully, they can reach audiences, but the system as a whole is not yet stable. Distribution remains uneven. Exhibition is not fully controlled. The relationship between production and audience access is still not entirely secure. And this means that Gainsborough's success, while real, exists within limits. It depends on conditions that are not fully under control. And as a result, it is difficult to sustain indefinitely. This is where Gainsborough becomes particularly revealing, because it shows that audience success alone is not enough to create an industry. You can produce films that people want to see. You can even produce them consistently for a time. But without a structure that supports that production, without control over how those films are distributed and exhibited, the success remains vulnerable. At the same time, Gainsborough's films highlight something else. They reveal a gap between what audiences respond to and what the industry is able or willing to define as its identity. The melodramas are popular. They are widely seen. They generate strong audience engagement, but they are not always treated as central to the idea of British cinema. They are sometimes viewed as excessive, as lacking restraint, as operating outside the more respectable definitions of national film culture. This perception affects how the industry understands itself. If the films that audiences actually watch are not fully embraced as defining examples of British cinema, then they do not become the foundation for a stable identity. Instead, they remain slightly separate, successful, but not fully integrated into the idea of what British cinema is supposed to be. And this creates a tension, because the films that work are not always the films that are valued, and the films that are valued are not always the films that build audiences. This tension will recur in different forms at different stages, but here it is particularly visible. Gainsborough is giving audiences what they want, but it is not yet providing a framework that the industry can build around. And so, despite its success, it does not resolve the underlying problem. It does not create a system. What it does instead is demonstrate something that will become increasingly important, that British cinema can succeed commercially, but struggles to translate that success into structural stability. This is not a failure of the films themselves, it is a limitation of the environment in which they exist. Because without coordination, without a system that connects production to distribution to exhibition, success cannot easily be scaled. It cannot easily be reproduced indefinitely, and it cannot easily be protected from external pressures. Those pressures remain present. American cinema continues to exert influence, supplying films consistently and maintaining a strong presence in British cinemas. Distribution channels remain uneven. The broader structure of the industry remains unstable, and so Gainsborough's success exists within a space that is, by its nature, temporary, a moment where British cinema demonstrates what it can do, but not yet how to sustain it. There is also a question of timing, because the Gainsborough melodramas emerged during the 1940s in the context of war. The Second World War shapes the conditions under which these films are produced and received. Audiences are living through a period of uncertainty, disruption, and constraint. Cinema becomes not just entertainment, but a form of escape, a space in which heightened emotion, dramatic conflict, and clearly defined narratives offer a contrast to the complexities of everyday life. This context helps to explain the intensity of the response to Gainsborough's films. They are not simply popular in isolation, they are popular within a specific historical moment, and that moment does not last. As conditions change, so too does the environment in which these films operate. the cycle that defines Gainsborough's success begins to lose momentum. The repetition that once drove the audience engagement becomes less effective. The context that supported the films shifts, and without a stable underlying structure, there is nothing to sustain the cycle once it begins to decline. This is the limitation of a model based on repetition alone. It can generate success, but it cannot guarantee its continuation, which is why Gainsborough sits where it does in this history, not as an endpoint, but as a signal that the problem is not one of audience engagement, it is one of organisation. Because once it is clear that audiences can be reached, the question changes. It is no longer, can British cinema succeed? It becomes, how can that success be stabilised? How can it be turned from a cycle into a system? And that is the question that leads directly to the next phase. Because what follows is not simply another cycle of films. It is an attempt to address the problem that Gainsborough leaves unresolved. The problem of control. Control over production, control over distribution, control over exhibition. And that attempt will take place under very different conditions. Conditions shaped not just by the industry itself, but by something larger, the war.